Hi, I'm Jay Faulkner. I'm a software developer with G-Research Open Source Software and Security Liaison for Ironic as part of the OpenStack Ironic Distributed Leadership Team. I wanted to speak to you a little bit today about our plans for the upcoming 6 months of Ironic features. So every 6 months, we have these meetings. We call them PTGs, which stands for Project Team Gathering, which is where members of the Ironic team and really any team working on an open infrastructure foundation project from all across the world get together and meet virtually in video conference form in order to help plan out the next 6 months or sometimes even more of work. We just got completed with the Gazpacho or 2026.1 planning meetings last week. And so I wanted to take a little bit of time and let you know about what we've got in store from Ironic. So first of all, I just want to let you know this video is here to make the information a little more accessible. But as always, the source information, the work item spec itself will be linked in the description. So if you want more detail, that's going to link into secondary sources of information like bugs or maybe design etherpads or things where there'll be a little bit more information. This is just sort of meant to be a menu to see if there's things that we're working on that you're interested in and to give an idea of the direction of where we're going. So first of all, we're just going to go down the list here. A couple of caveats, though, is that we're all very busy people. We work on lots of open source projects, sometimes more than even just OpenStack-based stuff. And so these are our plans, but don't confuse a plan for a promise. So we want to work on these. A lot of us might even have, might be waiting for this ourselves, but when you read this, think of this as stuff that we're going to make progress on this 6 months, not necessarily stuff that's going to be ready for you to consume in that 2026.1 release. We have a pretty good history of getting, 50, 75% of them in the release we planned them, but that's not what this list is for. This list is more about knowing what's going on so that you can participate with that process if you'd like. So first of all, let's talk about some post-eventlet performance improvements. So what happened is with Eventlet, we were getting a lot of sort of performance stuff for free by the fact it did automatic green threading. Now that we've excised Eventlet from our code base, there are quite a few things here that we can address that are performance issues that we can go down. Some of these, and this isn't even specifically listed in the work items, but some of them are bugs, such as, undesirable behaviors when we're talking about, doing things that are long running, such as checking the hash on an image, and we're having to refactor some of that code to get the bugs out. But this is more focusing on high level patterns. So for instance, if you've managed an Ironic installation, you probably had a situation before where you've seen Ironic updating multiple nodes through things like the project power sync loop for your nodes or, the various reconciliation tasks that might run. So what we're looking at is using new technologies like async IO, which may not be new to the Python world, but they're new to us because we couldn't really use them with Eventlet so well. But seeing if we can use things like that true native Python async to make these items that we have to do, especially across multiple pieces of hardware, go a lot faster. And so we currently have a proof of concept up using async IO, and we're going to be testing that, seeing what we can do to get a faster implementation of that backend stuff to you, utilizing all of the pieces that are there. And kind of on a related note, we have these deferred tasks. So with Eventlet and green threading, it was a pretty common pattern to, let's say you had a process you were doing that took 3 steps, and each step maybe might have taken the BMC 3-4 minutes to complete. Well, in an Eventlet world, that's not necessarily a big deal. Green threads are cheap. While we're waiting for the BMC to respond, we can go do work in other places. But in a pure threading model, this becomes problematic because that thread kind of gets held on to and used up the entire time. So what we want to do is introduce a way to get rid of those sleep calls and conductor threads where we're waiting for something to happen and eating up that thread. But in order to do that, we're going to need some type of framework that at a high level, gives us the ability to break something out into, 3 things that need to be done, 3 tasks, and then defer those tasks to later whenever the machine is ready for them. So this is currently under design right now. So if that sounds like a problem you're interested in, go check out the source material, click on that link and give some feedback. So next up is going to be Sushi integration into Ironic. So if you're not familiar, Sushi is an OpenStack library that was written to help Ironic and Ironic-based tools talk with Redfish BMCs. What we've discovered, though, is that the value of having a library often is outweighed by the additional support burden of having to maintain that library, especially in cases where, let's say, a bug fix might require an update to the library, a release of the library, then an update of requirements, and an update in Ironic to actually use it. That's sort of a 4-step thing that could turn into a 1-step thing if we didn't have it as a separate library. So we actually have an ask out to the mailing list. We're trying to make sure that if there are people who've used it, despite the fact that we've documented saying, this is kind of only for us, we want you to speak up, let us know so that we don't break you unexpectedly. I will say that right now our plan is, even if we do take that code out of the library and put it into Ironic, is that we want to make sure that it stays relatively independent enough inside of Ironic that if you needed to import it directly, that still might be a sensible thing to do. So if that's something you're interested in, please do have a look at the mailing list, respond to it if you're opposed, but otherwise just know that in the future, we're going to have a little bit less friction getting security fixes and hardware fixes out to you. Next up is NVMe-over-TCP support. So if you're not familiar, NVMe is a high-end performance technology that usually utilizes PCIe. Well, obviously, it doesn't so much if it's over TCP. So this is kind of a modern way of doing remote attached storage. So we're going to be looking at adding NVMe over TCP connector support, implementing sort of configuring a BMC to do that NVMe boot. And we've also coordinated some with Cinder and Nova during the PTG about attachment flow improvements that'll have to happen. So our hope is that this will enable folks to use these more modern remote storage protocols with Ironic. And this is really important. If someone has an array that supports NVMe over TCP, they're going to want this. And so this is a place we're going to focus on. So in previous releases, we had shipped a graphical console for Redfish. If you're not familiar, it exists. You can go deploy it today if you're already using 2025.2. However, there were some pieces of that implementation that we didn't necessarily love that we're going to cycle back to. First of all is there's some integration testing changes that are getting in place to allow us to more fully understand that this is working end to end. And that's a prerequisite to us exposing that actually via the Nova API. So if you're using a fully integrated Ironic with Nova, you may not be able to use the graphical console yet from that Nova interface, but we are working on that. We're also looking at implementing new console drivers because due to the nature of just the technology behind how graphical consoles work on hardware, we're having to spin up basically a container for every console that people are looking at. So there are other ways of spinning up containers. Everyone has their own choice way of doing it. We support one way, and we're looking at maybe enhancing that. This is actually a case where if you've looked at this support and you've gone, gosh, I wish Ironic did X, then you really need to reach out to us and let us know what that X is. Give us some idea, because we don't have a strong opinion in this place about how to run containers other than just folks trying to scratch their own itch as developers who are also operators or who are building a product. So if there's something there that you need or want, go ahead and file an issue, talk with our team, and we'll figure it out. I'm not going to promise that we'll get it done, but we can try. Next up is trait-based networking. So this started out last cycle, and it's a feature that has made minor progress from last cycle. We're trying to enable dynamic port and port group attachment based on traits defined in configuration. We're basically halfway there to getting our first milestone ready of being able to dynamically assign pre-created ports and port groups based on these rules. And what this is useful for is if you've got multiple interfaces on a node and potentially multiple networks as well, being able to define which physical NIC hooks into which actual network. And right now in Ironic, there's a very coarse one-to-one mapping, and we're trying to make that a little more dynamic. When we begin work on milestone 2, which I expect to happen during this cycle, we're also going to add support for flexibly creating port groups on the fly so that you could configure Ironic in such a way where, depending on the networks requested and the nodes in question, where Ironic might dynamically assemble multiple ports together into a port group on the fly and provision it that way, which will be very interesting for folks who maybe have use cases where sometimes they have two networks, but sometimes maybe they have one and you don't want to lose that bandwidth. Sort of keeping on the networking train, which is going to be here for the next couple of topics, VXLAN attachments. So we have some users who are scaling out environments with native VXLAN support. I could sit here and pretend like, they're struggling, but the reality is most of them are carrying patches today. We don't really love that. We want to support things upstream. If someone needs something, we don't want them to have to patch it downstream. And for VXLAN support, that's what we're hoping to fix up, where we're going to be able to enable and officially support hooking up bare metal nodes to VXLAN network and sort of work around the scaling limitations of VLAN. This will include adding Neutron ML2 plugin support for VXLAN with physical networks, adding some support in Ironic for VXLAN binding, and then some changes in networking generic switch to help it do the configuration step on the actual switch. One thing I'll note about this is that this does touch a lot of corners of OpenStack. This is going to interact with Neutron. It might interact with Nova a little bit. It's going to interact with multiple pieces of Ironic. So, at the beginning, I said a lot of the things we talk about are stuff that's going to be worked on, but not necessarily get to an endpoint. I would say this is one of those potential pieces where we're going to have so many moving parts. I'd be very pleasantly surprised if we got that done this cycle. But, hey, we're going to try, and who knows? So next up is looking at standalone networking. So right now, even if you're a person who's using, what we call standalone Ironic, there are often some services you have to deploy alongside, most commonly Keystone and Neutron. With Keystone, we've already done some work to add basic off to Ironic. I would expect that to generally mature, even though it's not a specific work item. But the other leg there is networking. And so what we want to do is provide a path that doesn't require running multiple OpenStack services if your mainly desired is just to run Ironic. And so we've got a working prototype written up for standalone networking. We're going to try to get it merged this cycle. And this is going to allow placement of nodes into VLANs using networking generic switch, except for instead of calling networking generic switch by calling a Neutron API and having it sort of filter down into networking generic switch at the end, we're adding an interface where Ironic is just going to tell networking generic switch what to do. So this is nice because you're going to get those years of switch drivers that have been being worked on in the networking generic switch project without having to take the whole Neutron stack if you don't want to. And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with running everything in OpenStack but the kitchen sink. You can run the fully integrated. In fact, for a lot of use cases, it's what people need. But we're finding that if we can scale down Ironic's footprint, we can get it into places or into environments that maybe a whole OpenStack cluster wouldn't make sense for. So next up is API response schema validation. This is to help with Open API specification writing. This was already in progress last cycle. We made some progress here with getting a little bit of better testing and starting to merge some of the schema changes. This work is pretty slow because it takes a lot of review and careful testing to make sure that we are re-implementing our API validation properly, because that's essentially what we're doing is a refactor of sort of the validation of the shape of the requests and the shape of the responses. And so if we make an error here, it's going to reverberate down across the API and affect your scripts. So this is moving a little bit slower than you might expect based on, what it sounds like it is. But really, this is a topic that sort of is hiding a refactor of our API code behind it. So we're making progress. I'm personally going to make it a priority to help review this code this cycle. But again, we don't want to promise that anything's going to get done. And I will note that this ties into an effort that the SDKs team and some folks over there have been working on for a long time to get Open API support. If you're an old guy like me and you've not heard of Open API, if you've seen a Swagger API definition, it's essentially comparable to that, like a newer version of the specifications. So next up, this is a relatively small feature in terms of code for Ironic, but it allows me to talk about a big issue that's coming up, which is that some BMCs are not supporting HTTP or HTTPS for virtual media, and instead require you to provide the image you want to share over an NFS network file system or a Samba or CIFS share. And that is unfortunate. Right now in Ironic, if you are trying to use NFS or SMB, you're just going to fail validation. We're going to say that's not a valid URL and throw it away. Essentially, we're just making our code aware of these transport protocols so folks using standalone Ironic and willing to host their own Samba share or NFS share will be able to use Ironic to coordinate machines through that. We don't currently have plans to add Ironic management of the actual network file system services, but I don't necessarily think we have some sort of philosophical opposition to it. It's just not really an ask we've had. I would strongly encourage you, if you're purchasing hardware, don't just ask if virtual media is supported. Make sure it's virtual media via HTTP or HTTPS for maximum compatibility. And quite frankly, just architecturally not wanting to have to expose a Samba or NFS server to your BMC network is ideal. So next up is hardware health monitoring. So if you're not familiar, we do a little bit of sensor data gathering already using Ironic Prometheus Exporter, where we might crawl the nodes, get some sensor data, and then have that get picked up by the Prometheus Exporter and tossed into Prometheus or whatever you're using as a backend there. But what this is going to add support for is actually a Redfish native system status feature. So we can actually ask the Redfish BMC about health status from the systems, the network adapters, some other pieces in there, record any changes we see in the node history, and expose that information via the API. It's just basically when we do a loop and we get power status, we're also just going to ask hardware status as well. And the nice thing about that is that our friends over at Metal Cubed, which is powered by Ironic, are going to look at exposing that status field to help out with Kubernetes deployment. So that's kind of a pattern of these features is, we talk about the stuff that's being worked on, but the reality is we have all sorts of use cases from, my downstream at G Research doing high performance computing to, folks at Red Hat servicing, all sorts of large scale or even smaller scale deployments as a product to, the folks at Metal Cubed who are trying to fit, an OpenStack service, a Python service into a Kubernetes shaped API. So that's why kind of sometimes our features can be interesting, but the nice thing is it all converges really well. There's going to be so much benefit to people who run in any sort of environment about this hardware health monitoring, even if it's specifically asked for by the Metal Cubed folks. That's sort of the strength of having lots of people in the community. And that's why I've set up at almost the end of every one of these that, come join the community, come let us know what you think, ask us for what you want, tell us what you expected that maybe was different, and that'll be fed in. We'll strongly consider that next time we do one of these gatherings. And so you get your voice heard. I'm also just going to note, it's 6 months away at this point, but we always welcome operators to come sit in on the project teams gathering. We publish schedules ahead of time so you can come for specific topics. So, don't look aside from that. Come join us. But we got a couple things left here, so I'm going to get back to the list. We have a database character set migration. This is one that is going to be spicy for most OpenStack users. MySQL has deprecated 3-byte UTF-8 encoding. So if you have ever seen the UTF-8 MB3 care set, that's what that's referring to, which essentially is just it supports UTF-8 as long as you fit the character in 3 bytes, whereas usually you have up to 4 bytes to store it. So that's kind of awkward because we've used UTF-8 MB3 since before UTF-8 MB4 existed. So we're going to have to migrate that, but that's going to be an OpenStack-wide problem. There are multiple other projects in OpenStack that have this issue where they're going to have to do an encoding swap. And if you're a person who's done database operations, you know that this signals a downtime upgrade. So just go ahead, keep that in mind that there's likely going to be a database migration coming your way. If not this cycle, then maybe the next one where you might have to take a little bit of offline downtime for your database to migrate this character set. Quite frankly, I prefer not do it, but when software we depends on deprecates a feature that we're using, we have to move forward. And that is a lesson we've learned a lot having run OpenStack for 15 years at this point. So finally, some driver retirements. So this is always, on one hand, it's kind of sad, but on the other hand, it's kind of exciting because, it is sad to get rid of the ILO driver, which has been one of the best drivers in Ironic for a period of our history, but it does have a dependency on PySNMP. The upstream vendor library ProLiant Utils is not actively maintained, and the Ironic developers do not have merge access or really access to that project to modernize it at all. So we're kind of stuck. We're going to have to remove that ILO driver from ironic in order to just continue having drivers that we can support. So one thing to note is that this only supports really old ILO versions at this point. Ideally, you're able to use the Redfish driver. And if you're using the Redfish-based drivers, then everything's going to keep working. If you are using that ILO driver, I am sorry, but this is more or less technical issues that are outside of the team's control that are forcing it to be gone. Additionally, the IRMC driver, which is a driver that talks to Fujitsu EMCs, that currently also holds a dependency on PySNMP and an older package of PySNMP, which is not really kept security updated anymore. So that is also on the chopping block for deprecation and removal. We have reached out to people at Fujitsu, and we've reached out to the mailing list generally looking for users to see if we can get anyone to commit to upstream maintenance. But in lieu of that, we're going to be removing those. And when we do, we'll add an upgrade check so that it'll warn you as long as you're running your upgrade checks before you upgrade. And we also will backport those upgrade checks so that, maybe you're not running Flamingo yet. Well, perhaps by the time you get Flamingo, it'll warn you about this case, about this impending deprecation. One other thing I just want to highlight is we used to sort of gloss over this a little bit, but there are recurring maintenance tasks that Ironic developers always have to do. Stuff like releasing branches, retiring old ones, doing bug triage, and making sure that we're being good members of the overall OpenStack ecosystem by meeting our deadlines internally and hitting those release times and stuff. So these are the sort of things we have to think about that aren't features. And as always, we do have a public OpenStack release schedule that you can look at. And so you can see we've been developing in this cycle since October 3rd. And then we're expecting the Gazpacho release to be official in early April. So I look forward to seeing you at the PTG in 6 months, where we're going to talk about what we'll work on 2026.2 H word that hasn't been selected yet. But for now, that's all I've really got to talk to you about. So thank you so much for listening. I hope this was helpful. It'd really be nice if you could like the video, subscribe if you haven't yet. We have lots of content on the channel here about Ironic, about OpenStack. We have podcasts hosted by me and one of my colleagues, Tabitha, about various open source stuff, usually centered around, infrastructure ecosystems or machine learning or even kind of like corporate open source. So sort of the realms that G Research open source software tends to operate in. So check that out. And if you're watching this and you're in or around London, UK, go to gresearch.com. There's always events there. They've always got smart people coming to talk. You can go meet those smart people. You can apply for jobs. And if you do see someone there and we sent you, just tell them that you appreciate the content here on YouTube. But for now, I'm Jay Faulkner. Have a good evening. Thank you.